Good morning. Morning. And welcome to today's webinar, which is Herbs Beyond Basil. My name is Marianne Simon. I am a longtime landscape designer, and herbs are actually the way that I found my way into my profession. Certainly when I was cooking, I would use herbs. Occasionally, I would make a mint tea, but I didn't really think too much about it until I found this beautiful book on herbs and all the different ways that we can work with them. So today's webinar is really an overview, big picture, the idea that it potentially expands your knowledge of your understanding of what can be done with herbs and really allows for an opportunity to experiment and to play. So most of us are familiar with herbs and the way that we can use them in our foods to spice things up, to give them more flavor. We also know that, herbs can certainly be used for medicinal purposes. For example, you might make a ginger tea if you have an upset stomach, or mint is great if you've got any sort of sore throat. So the different ways that we can use herbs to make ourselves feel better. And then, of course, the way that herbs and plants, in general, have been used to create what we wear, to make baskets, to color things, the beautiful yellows and indigos. Those are all originally from plants. And then, of course, the way that plants and herbs are used in our spiritual practices, whether or not is smudging with sages, potentially working with incenses to clear the spirits, to welcome in whatever the spirits are. There has been a long relationship of humankind with plant kind as far as that kind of work. So as we explore today's topics, there's 6 different pieces of the puzzle that we're going to be looking at. And if this is your first class, we use the puzzle as a metaphor, really, that everything that we talk about is connected. So we're not going to look at anything in isolation or in solo, but really at how things fit all together. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about watershed-wise basics, what that is and how we use it as a lens, really, for our gardens. Number 2 is looking at herbs in the garden. So how do herbs, how do we find them? How do we work with them in the landscape? Number 3, all the different ways that you can organize your herbs into different themes, whether or not they are integrated into the landscape or you have specific herb gardens or portions of an herb garden that fit your particular desires. Number 4 is a conversation about selecting herbs and some of the different things you might think about as you bring them into your garden. Number 5 is growing and propagating them. So there is no reason that you can't grow your own. And we'll show you a couple of different ways to do that. And then number 6, the last piece of a puzzle, is how do you prepare your herbs? So yes, you can absolutely cut them from the garden, but what if you want to hold on to them or use them in a way that might be a little bit different? So let's get started. First off, with a definition. So herbs, the herb part of a plant is the leafy, fleshy part of the plant. The spices, and we use these sometimes a little bit interchangeably, the spices are actually the seeds, the stems, the woody part of the plant. And sometimes you'll grind that or you'll chop it up very fine in order to use it. Sometimes you'll burn it or steep it. So lots of different ways that we can use the material of the plant. Okay, puzzle piece number 1, watershed-wise basics. So in a moment, you're going to understand where herbs fit into this idea of a balanced watershed. But in nature, a natural system of this watershed is an area of land where all of the water that flows over it or drains under it goes to the same place. So you can see with this image that we've got a hillside, we've got a river. So the top of the watershed is going to be the top of the hillside. The river is the bottom of the watershed. And so we've got precipitation that falls from the sky. It's slowed by the plants. As it makes its way to the ground, a couple of things can happen. One, it's going to flow overland into our river, or it can make its way into the soil, percolate on down in. And as it does that, it is cleaned and filtered by the roots of the plants and by the biology that is in the soil. That biology in the soil is so critical to the health of all plants. And then from there, a couple things can happen. One, it can actually move sideways, that water, making its way to the river, or it can continue to percolate on down. And that is how we replenish our aquifers, right? How we refill our water table. And then the sun comes up, that water evaporates or evapotranspires, goes back up into the sky, and we start that process all over again. So what we want you to do is to look at your property as a mini watershed. So the top of the roof is the top of the watershed, the top of the mountain. The street is the bottom of the watershed, the river. And then everything in between it is within our ability to improve. So there's 4 key principles to the watershed. And again, this applies to any garden. Doesn't matter if it's your front yard, your backyard, where you're talking a few small square feet, or you've got acres and acres that you are working with. The principles apply. So the first one, and it is really the heart and soul of a garden, and that is the soil. What we want is a healthy soil sponge so that there is the ability for that soil to hold on to water when it gets it and then release it to the plants as they need it. Number 2 is selecting climate appropriate plants. Yes, there's an emphasis on natives, but really the choices are what are the plants that are adapted, most suitable for the climate where you live. Number 3 is passively capturing rainwater. So this is something that we don't often talk about when we think about sustainability, but this is what makes it a watershed-wise landscape, that ability that when we get the rain, we are keeping it in the garden rather than losing it. And then number 4, highly efficient irrigation, but only as a supplemental source. We want to move away from the paradigm that every garden needs irrigation. Rather, what we want to be thinking is, does my garden have healthy soil? Am I using climate appropriate plants? Am I holding on to as much rain as possible? And when I have all 3 of these, the need for irrigation drops significantly, if not being turned off completely. So there's these 2 images we're looking at. The one on the left is what we would call a conventional landscape. Maybe there's turf, a tree, some perennials, but the soil is compacted, not a lot of biology. Potentially you're needing to rely on fertilizers in order to get your plants to bloom. The image on the right, this is what we aspire to. Doesn't matter what those plants are. We've got our soil, we're holding on to our rain. There's a diversity of plants. And we are inviting in all kinds of wildlife. So this is the big picture. This is the premise within which our conversation about herbs will flow. So first off, herbs love the soil. The healthier your soil is, the more biology there is. If you've got earthworms, that is wonderful. This is the environment within which your herbs will grow healthy so that you can get the most scent from them, the most flavor from them. When we look at the health of the soil, the other thing we need to consider is that balance of water and oxygen. So most people, when they think about the soil and, keeping it moist, they think about how much water that plant needs. The other piece of the puzzle is that soil also needs a balance of oxygen. So sure, if there's not enough water and there's too much oxygen, your plants are going to die. But when you have a situation where you've got too much water and not enough oxygen, you've actually created an environment for anaerobic life. Anaerobic life is where we start to get our pathogens. This is how our plants get diseases, and this is why they fail. So we're so used to a plant looking kind of limp when it doesn't have enough water, but the symptoms are very similar when it's being overwatered. Here's that conversation about oxygen. So it's quite possible as you are converting your garden, maybe you're taking out turf, or maybe you're taking over an area of land that was planted with something else, is we want to make sure that we get oxygen into it. We do this one time to get that oxygen in, and then we really don't want to disturb the soil after that. And then when it comes to watering. So watering is really the number one thing that will kill a plant. As we said, you can underwater it, obviously, and you can overwater it. So being mindful of how we are watering, how much water we are providing, very important. So when it comes to herbs, you can hand water. You can certainly use drip irrigation. Really, when it comes to drip, I would recommend it for anything except for turf or maybe large swaths of ground cover. So yes, herbs would be very happy with drip irrigation. And then we want to think about the roots. So oftentimes when we're thinking about plants, we are thinking about what we see above ground, right? You know, we see the branches, we see the flowers, we see the leaves, but we don't really think about what is happening beneath the surface. And there is an entire universe happening by there. This is where the biology is. This is where the water is. And the greater the area for the roots, the more access they have to those resources. So on the left, turf grass, I don't know, maybe 2-3 inches deep. If that, on the right, we have a perennial where we've got good draining soil. Those roots are going down. And it's really like looking at it as a reservoir. So if you were to put your plant into a baby jar, for example, that's how much water you have access to. That's how much biology is there. The biology is where the roots are. Compared to, I've got a gallon jug. That's what my plant is feeding off of. That's how deep the reservoir is for it to access its water. So much of the health, not just of your herbs, but all of your plants, is dependent on the health of your soil. And then creating that environment with the soil, with the water, and with making sure that the soil is covered. So nature really abhors a vacuum. When you think of, plants in nature, even in your own garden, they're dropping leaves, they're dropping twigs, they're dropping fruit. So as we are looking to grow our herb gardens, we want to make sure that our soil is covered with mulch, with compost. That serves to keep the soil cool, keep it moist, and then as it breaks down, it provides the food for that biology. All right. So sometimes when we are thinking about herbs, maybe we bought like a little herb plant at a nursery. We've put it on our windowsill, maybe it's on a pot, but I want to talk about all the different ways that herbs can be used, not just as separate herb beds, but as integrated into the landscape as a whole. So this is a delicious picture. The idea that there are these very neat, very organized beds, and you can absolutely do this with herbs. You can see one of the things that keeps them very tidy are these boundaries, these perimeters that are made with hedges, things like boxwood, rosemary, creates this very natural border. Now, long ago, when herbs were grown in monasteries, you would find these traditional cloister gardens. And odds are you don't live in a monastery, but that idea, again, of having a herb garden in some sort of enclosed space. So this can be on a balcony, potentially. This can be in a section of a garden. The idea, again, that the shapes tend to be pretty geometric. There are very defined planter areas. Oftentimes you've got decomposed granite or you've got gravel to be able to walk through these gardens. So they serve a function, a purpose, and they are also aesthetically very pleasing. But the key thing when it comes to a cloister garden is that they are enclosed and that they are easily accessible. So these were working gardens. Now, herbs can also be used the way you would other types of plants. So an example like this, you've got a focal point. Maybe it's a bird bath, maybe it's a fountain, maybe it's a piece of art. And the idea that you can line a path or a border that you create, that focal point by creating an edging, basically. We talked about creating borders or lining a path. So imagine the pleasure, and to me, herbs are all about pleasure. You're walking on a path. It can be a short path or a long meandering path from, say, the kitchen out to the garage. And as you're walking along, maybe you pick a sprig of rosemary, or you snip some herbs for the soup that you are making. But what it does, herbs, not only with how they look, but how they smell, just creates that experience as you are making your way through your garden. And then, depending on the herbs you select, they can certainly be accents. So what we're looking at here are alliums, which are onions or garlics. They're all in that family, scallions. And they have these great big pops of like balloon type flowers that rise up above the landscape. So again, looking at your landscape and seeing these puts a smile on your face. And then most herbs are also going to be pollinator attractors. So this is borage. This is an herb that you can use in salads. They are bee attractors. They are absolutely brilliant, as well as having those lovely, lovely blooms. So having pollinators in the garden means that that is how your edibles are pollinated. That is how other flowering plants are pollinated, as well as obviously supporting our insect population. And then hedges. So similar to how we saw that path before, the borders, some herbs actually can grow significantly high. In this case, this is rosemary. There's a form of rosemary that gets to be about 4 or 5 feet high. There are other herbs we talk about that are almost like small trees. So the idea that herbs are not separate from plants, they fall under the umbrella and can be used in all the same ways. Certainly in ground cover between pavers, thyme is absolutely wonderful for this. You can do it between concrete pavers. This is flagstone. It blooms, so as you step on it, you're going to have the wonderful scent there as well. And then the way that herbs can be used as an alternative to lawn. There is a lot of push to take out turf and replace it with climate appropriate plantings. Why not consider replacing it with herbs? This is chamomile. So yes, again, you've got these wonderful flowers that greet you in the morning. The possibility that you could go out and snip a little bit, make some chamomile tea while you were at it. And then obviously integrating it as part of a larger edible garden. So this is a big garden, but you can do the same thing with a small garden. So there's so much flexibility, so many different ways that you can play and explore when it comes to working with these. And they are perfect. Some of them, not all of them, are actually perfect for small spaces. So they do really, really well in pots. You can put them on stairs. You can put them on railings. You can put them on balconies. They work in large spaces, small spaces, you name it. And they work indoors. So all three of these that we're looking at in the image are Mediterranean herbs. They're going to like some light. Key things when it comes to plants, any kind of plant indoor actually, is going to be the proper light and the proper drainage. So what you don't want to do is pour water into a pot and have it standing in any kind of tray or dish with water in it. So you basically want to water it and then place it in the dish when most of it has drained. Otherwise, what happens again is you've got too much water in the soil and you get those anaerobic conditions and you'll eventually kill your plant. Let's talk about garden themes. So I've spoken kind of generally about different ways that you can use herbs in the garden. But this next section is to talk about organizing them in more specific or more deliberate ways. So we're going to start out with edible herbs, because again, that's the easiest one, the simplest frame of reference that we have. But the thing is, that there are herbs from all around the world. So again, the objective with today's conversation was to think beyond basil, or to think beyond what we typically know. So even from the Mediterranean, there may be herbs that you're not familiar with. We've got our usual suspects: parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. We've got basil there, tarragon, and it is a significant list of herbs that come from that Mediterranean area. But what if we were interested in doing sections of our garden with herbs from different continents, for example? And even as I do this section, this is such a drop in the bucket. When you talk about Asia, it's huge. I picked 3 herbs to share with you. So there's so much opportunity to explore and research and see what does well in your area, in your climate. So here are some. Again, some people may realize or be surprised when they find out where some of these herbs actually originate from. A super easy one to work with is ginger. And the uses for ginger are significant, very easy to grow, needs a little bit more moisture than some of those Mediterranean herbs. And that is because when we think about where it comes from, or where some of it comes from, typically in areas that get more moisture than you would in our Mediterranean climates. Another one that might be fun to play with is the Vietnamese mint. So you may know peppermint, you may know spearmint, there's a chocolate mint, but this is going to have a different flavor. So the idea, again, that you can experiment and see what lights up your taste buds. And then here's another one that we've probably been hearing about a lot: turmeric. It has all kinds of health benefits, right? You can get like a turmeric tea now. There's a picture of what it looks like, because there can be that disconnect. We buy the herb at the grocery store in a little jar, and we have no idea what the plant actually looks like. So wanting to include that for you as well. And for those of you that are not familiar, we wanted to go ahead and include what that flavor is. And it's a little bit like trying to describe a color, right? What does blue look like? So here we go. Here is the description that I found. An earthy essence with a touch of sweetness, accompanied by notes of ginger and pepper. So if that description, tickles your fancy, then experiment with turmeric. And now we have scallions. Scallions are in that onion family. They've got those, those sort of bubbles up the top with those different flowers, kind of a spicy flavor. You can use them in all kinds of cooking, not just Asian cooking, but again, something to experiment with. Now let's go down to Latin America. And again, so many different countries in Latin America, each of them with their nuances. But here are some that I thought would be kind of fun to share. First one is stevia. So you may have heard about stevia as a way of naturally sweetening your foods or your drinks, and literally a leaf goes a very, very long way. It is definitely sweet, and you can grow it in your own garden. Imagine making a mint tea and then putting in a leaf of stevia, and you have naturally sweetened tea. This next one is the pepicha. The description is citrusy with a bit of pine and mint and the bite of arugula. So this is a fun one to certainly to cook up. Anytime you cook a flavor up, it tends to neutralize it a little bit or sweeten it a little bit. Or you can go ahead and chop it up and add it to salads, top off a soup or a stew. And then Mexican mint. This is a plant that I grew in my garden for years and years. I'm in Southern California. It is incredibly drought tolerant. It has these amazing pops of these yellow flowers, just like the marigold. And I actually didn't know until I started doing the research that it was edible. So the scent is of tarragon and a little bit of a licorice flavor to it, but definitely a plant that can be in the landscape and then used in cooking. let us head over to the African herbs. And again, you've got North Africa and South Africa and West Africa and East Africa, all of them with their own flavors and nuances. So I started out with rooibos, one which may be fairly common, comes from South Africa and is used to make these wonderful, almost vanilla flavored teas. And then on top of that, you've got these, these lovely yellow blossoms. Then for those that like their food a little spicy, the opportunity to experiment a different kind of pepper flavor. There's all different kinds of peppers. So this one is the Ashanti pepper. Its leaves, look at the shape of its leaves. It probably does really, really well in filtered light. And then you can see how you've got the seeds there that have been dried, and eventually you would grind them for flavoring. And then this last one looks very, very similar to the plants that we use in our landscapes all the time. This is the Nigella sativa, a black cumin. And again, you've got this beautiful flower with these sort of like delicate lacy leaves. And you can harvest the seeds, and often used as a condiment, nutty onion-like flavor, most often found in flatbreads, vegetable dishes, and spice blends. And then we've got herbs from the Middle East. So the first one is that fenugreek. So it's so fascinating to look at these different plants. If I were to see this in a garden, I wouldn't think much of it. And yet, when I read the flavors, right, when it's cooked, it is sweet, slightly nutty with a maple syrup-like flavor, similar to burnt sugar. So imagine the experimenting, the way you can, try different flavors and see what happens. Here is sumac. Now this is a taller herb. This is not going to fit in a little pot on your step. It is used a lot in Middle Eastern cooking. I love it. I put it on, sprinkle on my rice. It's got this sharp lemon-like, slightly tangy flavor. And again, it has quite a bit of size to it. And then the last one is the anise. So this has the licorice flavor. If you've ever been to a Persian or a Middle Eastern restaurant, they will sometimes offer you a little bowl of the seeds, and you take a little bit and you bite on it, and it has this wonderful like cleansing capability to it. And then the other beautiful benefit of this, the anise, is the flower shape. So this is an umbel shape, and these are great attractors for butterflies, moths, and other pollinators. So those were our edible herbs that we could use in cooking, salads, soups, stews, etc. And perhaps you might be interested in having an area of the herb garden dedicated to different kinds of teas. So certainly you can have teas for the flavor. A lot of them also have medicinal benefits. So a common one is obviously going to be mint, chamomile. We've all heard of those. There's that stevia in there. You wouldn't make a tea just of stevia. You would add a leaf of it. But lemon verbena is absolutely amazing. That's something I would love to have in my soaps. Lemon balm, a pineapple sage that you can make teas out of it, and it's a great pollinator. When you are making teas, a little tip there is that if you're using fresh leaves, you want to gather them early in the morning when their essence is at its freshest. You don't want to crush the soils because it's all about capturing those oils in the infusion that you are making. And you'd need about 3 teaspoons of tea leaves, plant leaves, to make yourself that cuppa in the mornings. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the idea of using herbs for healing purposes. Once upon a time, before we had Western medicine, we relied on plants to help with aches, pains, disease, illnesses, fatigue, depression, everything. Every ailment was met with plants as the solution. So it's a wonderful alternative from having to run out to the drugstore and getting something for a cough or for a stuffy nose, that you can go out into your garden and pick something that might make you feel better. So I'm listing just a few. There's all kinds of wonderful books to read about what herbs help with what ailments, what doses to work in. Some of the ones that might be a little bit of a surprise are holy basil, which you can take, that helps with blood sugar management. Mint, most everybody knows that mint is great for the stomach and for just calming the system. And then sage is really wonderful for sore throats, as well as an antioxidant. A few more, no surprise, that garlic, right? Whenever you're making chicken soup, when you're feeling a little bit under the weather, you're putting in a ton of garlic. So garlic is super helpful with supporting the immune system. Ginger also for the stomach. When you hear about taking echinacea and golden seal, when you're feeling a cold coming on, that's the coneflower. And then thyme is actually a wonderful antibacterial option. All right, puzzle piece number 4. Now we've just been 3 puzzle pieces that may have already prompted you in terms of what types of herbs you were going to go out and get or grow. But we also wanted you to understand plants from a water requirement perspective. So not all herbs have the same water requirements. We have a range here of how much water different plants need. At the left, you've got your poster child for high water use, and that is turf. Requires a lot of water to keep it looking green and healthy. Moderate water users need about half of that. And then obviously, as you move into the low and very low, then you are cutting back significantly. By the time you get to a very low water using plant, you've got maybe, 10% of the amount of water that is used by turf. So in those parts of the country where drought is a big concern, and actually with climate change, that's potentially a concern everywhere, we do want to pick our plants mindfully when it comes to water use. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at a series of herbs, show you some of the commonalities, why typically one type of herb might need less water than another. So the first big difference that we're going to find is that perennial herbs are going to typically use less water than annuals. Annuals are herbs that basically have one life cycle. So you're going to plant them, they're going to grow, they're going to go into leaf. At a certain point, they will go to flower, they will go to seed, and that will be the end of them. Compared to perennials or woody shrubs that will come back year after year after year. So because so much growing happens in an annual herb, so much of their life cycle happens in a very short period of time, they are going to typically need more water. And now some herbs we're going to go through just to give you an idea. Again, this may not be the make or break why you get an herb, but it's just another interesting piece to understand as you make your selection. So oregano, Mediterranean herb, low water user, thyme also. So all of these in the Mediterranean climate, when you think of where they come from, Mediterranean climate, there's 5 of them, right? You've got South Africa, you've got Chile, you've got Australia, you've got the Mediterranean, and you've got California. So when we think of what the climate is, we understand why these are potentially low water using plants. Rosemary is another one. You've got lemon verbena. So this was one of the ones that's wonderful for teas, also for different kinds of products like soaps and lotions. And then you've got your mints. So mints are perennial, but when we think of where mint grows, they typically are happier in filtered light or in shady conditions. So when it comes to mint, There's different kinds of them, different flavors. So the idea that you could have a mint garden with different flavors of mints in there. One of the other things to know about mint is it can be quite invasive. So those are good to plant in pots or definitely in contained spaces. Now, cilantro is one. This is one that comes from Latin America, and it is both an herb and a spice. So this plant in its herb form is cilantro, in its spice form is known as coriander. So, I didn't in the beginning realize that these were one and the same plant. Again, because it is an annual, it is a high water user. Different kinds of parsleys, flat leaf, curly leaf. There's an Italian parsley. They're basically going to have one season, and then you'll be looking to either plant seeds from them or buy new ones. So now we come to basil. And basil is very interesting. It's actually why we called the class herbs beyond basil, is because most of us, when we think of basil, we think of that typical sweet basil, right, that you make pesto out of. But when you do a little bit of research, you find out that there are multiple kinds of basil with very different flavors. Not all of them are annuals. So you've got sweet basil, which is a high ET plant. It is an annual, so you're going to have to replace it at the end of its season. But then there are several basils that are medium water users, lemon, Greek, purple basil, and then you've got this Thai basil. So Thai basil is actually a perennial. It is a low water user, and I have put this plant in the middle of the rest of my landscape. I put it in there with my sages, with my roses, with my citrus, because it's got this beautiful leaf shape and these lovely purple flowers that attract the pollinators. And then chives. Again, you can recognize by that flower now, perhaps, that this is part of the onion family. It is an annual, super easy to grow. I mean, literally, you just snip a little bit every time you need it for its cooking. And it has the greenery as well as those lovely little puffs of purple. All right, let us move into now growing and propagating. What if you wanted to be able to grow your own? So we're going to start out with growing annuals. It's different when we're growing perennials, basically. So once again, an annual is defined as having a very short lifespan, anywhere between 6 or 12 months. Typically, the environment that it's going to be happiest in is relatively warm weather, sunshine, good soil, and good soil really applies to everything we're growing. But especially if we're going to be starting them, we need to make sure that it is really well draining, right? We don't want water sitting in a soil for too long. And then as far as the moisture level, we want it moist but not soggy. So imagine the way a sponge feels after you've wet it, squeezed it, and then how it feels after you've squeezed it, right? So it's moist, but there's nothing else dripping out of it. And then as those plants get established, we're going to want to be adding mulch. So here's some other things to think about when you are working with herbs that are annual. So again, these are high water users. When you grow them, you want to give them a little bit of space so that they're not all on top of each other, allow for some nice air circulation. The other thing that you want to be aware of is at a certain point, your herb will go to flower. Now, sometimes that happens, for example, this is basil. It can happen more quickly if it's in a lot of sunshine, like it sort of accelerates things. But at the point where your plants are starting to go to flower, that is coming to the end of their life cycle. So if you want that plant to last longer, you want to go ahead and pinch those flowers. At a certain point, the plant will come to its end and, you can pinch to your heart's content and that won't stop the process. But certainly in the beginning, when you're starting to see flowers, you can pinch them. The other thing that's helpful is to harvest them. Because again, whenever we cut them, we are encouraging this growth of new leaves. Then pretty much when you can see that it has gone to flower. It will continue to go to seed. We're going to talk a little bit later about how you can capture that seed. But at that point, your plant is potentially done. Now, if it's in the garden, you can actually just cut it to the ground, leave the roots where they are, and then you can compost whatever's left if it's not something that you want to save to dry. Now, another way that you can grow herbs is by propagating them from cuttings. So there's two different kinds of cuttings we're going to talk about. There's soft stemmed and then there's woody stemmed. So here we have mint. This is a great example. Mint propagates incredibly easy. This is probably why they can be a little bit invasive in the garden. So things that you want to think about if you are propagating it, we're going to be putting it into water, is you're going to want to cut. So you can see on the image, there's two things that are indicated. There is the node. The node is where the leaves sort of originate from. And then the cut is actually just below it. So if you cut right at a node, it will encourage more leaf growth. What we want to do is cut below it because we're going to want to take that stem and put that in the water. Once you have your cut, you're looking at about 4 to 6 inches. You have a nice piece to work with. You want to go ahead and strip the leaves from the lower part of it. Because if we put the leaves in the water, they will start to rot and the water gets all funky and is not what we are trying to achieve. So instead you strip all those leaves, you put them in the water on a sunny windowsill. I wouldn't recommend putting it on a windowsill where you're getting like southern or western exposure because sun coming through the glass is going to cook your plant. But you know, eastern is great, or sort of a reflected light is wonderful. And it'll take, you know, potentially a couple of weeks before you start, you know, seeing some significant roots. And what you want to do is change that water every couple of days. We want to make sure that that water stays clean. And then once there are roots, a significant amount of roots, you can judge what that is. You can go ahead and move it into the garden or into a pot. Now here we have propagating herbs from cuttings that are woody plants. So the example here is rosemary. This is going to go directly into the soil as opposed to putting it in water to grow the roots. Again, we are working with about 4 to 6 inches. What is important to notice when you take your cutting on a woody plant, and actually the same thing with a soft stem, is you want to make sure that there's no flowering happening there. Because when there's flowering, that's where the plant's energy is going. And we want the energy to go towards the roots. So you're going to go ahead and cut a stem, make sure there's nothing blooming. Same thing, we're going to go ahead and strip off, not as much as we need with the water, but some of that leafy so that we've got the stem exposed. We'll go ahead and dip it in rooting hormone that accelerates that rooting process. And then you're going to go ahead and plant it into, again, relatively loose, well-draining soil. So it's not like we want to stick it into compact clay soil. We want to create or provide an environment where it's going to be easy for those roots to start to spread. After about, I don't know, a couple of weeks, you should start to get some of those roots. And we're going to go ahead and transition it from indoors, especially, you know, if the weather is less than ideal, to the outdoors. And in doing that, we are doing something called hardening off, which is basically we are preparing the plant to transition to an environment that might be a little less cuddling, you know, sort of like taking your kid to kindergarten, right? Helping them make that transition. So what you're going to do is you're going to take that plant in its little pot and you're going to put it outside in the partial shade. So nothing too harsh. So it's protected from the sunlight. It's out there during the day when the temperatures are more moderate. And then you're going to bring it back indoors at night. And then you do that every day. As you move forward over time, you let the parameters get a little bit more extreme. Maybe you put it out into the full sunshine for a little bit longer, and then you bring it back into so you're kind of easing your plant into the outdoors. And then after about a week, it should be ready to plant. And what we want to do is take the plant and the soil around it and transition it into, again, whether it's a pot outdoors or into the ground outdoors, so that we don't disturb those delicate roots. Now, the other thing that you can do is propagate from seeds. And seeds are so inexpensive, and you can get, dozens, if not hundreds of different plants from seeds. Same thing, you've got to be a little bit patient. You're going to be working in an area that is protected, so it's not out in the beating sun. It's not too cold. Typically, we encourage with seeds something called peat pots or newspaper pots. You can use seed starting flats, but what's nice about those first two is that they will break down in the soil, so you don't have to lift anything out. You can even grow them in like egg containers, the cardboard ones, right? The idea is that you can just cut it, or that you can take the entire container without having to move anything out of it and put that in the soil. Then again, the soil requirements are very much the same. It's pre-moistened, it's loose, draining, so that water is going through relatively quickly. We don't want water sitting in the soil with seeds. We don't want it to rot or get any sort of fungal disease. Once you've got that soil in, you've wetted it, it's drained, you're going to go ahead and create, whether it's little holes or little indentations, to go ahead and put your seeds in. Sometimes they are so tiny you can barely see them. So it's not even holes, it's just like you put your little finger in it and then you're going to cover it with soil. And then the same thing is that you're going to go ahead and keep it moist. Sometimes people will use misters to spray it. And the idea is you don't want to let them dry out, that they are vulnerable at this stage as they are starting to germinate. So they've been protected up to this point, right, with their seed coating. But as they start to germinate, that is when they are the most vulnerable. So we want to keep that moist, not wet. So potentially you're misting it once a day, maybe twice a day in the very beginning. And then, and then just checking it over time. Sometimes what people will do is they will actually take like a plastic bag or saran wrap and create almost like a greenhouse effect on it, so that the moisture and the humidity stays there. It's not evaporating. And then that means that you are wetting it less frequently. Now, as you start to get your little seedlings coming up, some things that you can do again to support its growth. We're adding just a little bit of food for the biology. So maybe we're adding a worm casting tea, or if you have fish emulsion, like half strength, so nothing that's like major, just a little bit of extra support as they are coming into themselves. The other thing is that if you, like I do, I sort of spill my seeds into a hole and all of a sudden you've got 10 or 12 seedlings come up. We do want to go ahead and pick the strongest ones, so that they're not, all smushed together. So if you've got, more than a couple, potentially you are plucking out the smaller ones and then letting the strongest, the sturdier ones grow to the next size. And then when they are ready, you can go ahead and go through that same process of hardening off and then taking them out into the garden. Now, this is really cool. The possibility that you can harvest your own seeds. And it's almost like magic. Like one day the seeds are there and the next thing they have exploded out into the air to be carried by the wind, by the water, by insects, by what have you. So what is that time? How do you nab them? And so there's this really great technique, which is you just take these little bags. You can do plastic bags. They've got special seed bags, cloth bags, lightweight. Obviously, we don't want anything that's bending that plant too significantly. And then you just tie it around. And when its time comes, it will explode from the pods and go out into the bag. And that's how you capture the seeds, especially when you've got like little teeny tiny ones. We show a sunflower there that obviously has much larger seeds that you can go ahead and pluck with your fingers, or set your kids to do that, and then all the different ways that those seeds can either be used to create new sunflowers, to be roasted, to eat, to be ground, to make sunflower butter, what have you. Now here we have an image of the different kinds of herbs that can be propagated via the different categories. So you've got those that are going to root best in water, and then you've got those, the woody ones, that grow best when rooted in soil. And then there's a few of them that will actually work in either situation. So you've got your mints that you can grow in either, and the rosemary actually will grow in either. So this is a way that you can work with neighbors, you can work within community gardens to exchange cuttings, where one plant basically becomes, 10 plants, and everyone in your family, in your community, can have their own. So the last piece of the puzzle is preparing the herbs. Up to this point, we've gone out into the garden with our little scissors and we've snipped the leaves and we've made teas with them, or maybe we've rubbed them on an injury, or we've cooked with them, or what have you. But what if we wanted to do something a little bit differently? So one of the things that you definitely want to consider is drying your herbs. Certainly when it comes to annuals, they have a very short lifespan. So the potential that you could dry those, and rather than being viable, for 2 or 3 months, they are now viable for a year or more. You can leave them literally just hanging from your ceiling, or if there's a pantry someplace, again, where there's where the air is warm, there's not a lot of moisture in it. Takes about a week or so. You can also, if you have a dehydrator, you can dry your herbs that way. And then the other thing you can do is you can dry them in the oven. The key thing with the oven drying is that the temperature is low enough to dry them without cooking them. Otherwise, you have cooked herbs instead of dried herbs. Now, spices will need to oftentimes be ground up so that you can really get the flavor of them. You can do it in the traditional ways with the mortar and pestle. You can get a coffee grinder. You can get those little mini like Cuisinarts that you can put them in, so that you can grind them up into the smallest size, and that's really where you get the essence of the flavor or the benefit of them. We've also talked about making teas. So teas are considered infusions, which basically means that you are drawing the flavor out of them in some sort of element. So we can do it in water, we can do it in oil, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But this is super easy. It's like you get water. It works more quickly if the water is hot. But you can certainly, they talk about sun teas, where you can take herbs, you put it in a jar, you leave it out in the garden. Eventually that water does warm up, but it does so in a very natural way. But certainly you can heat up your kettle and make your teas this way as well. So again, it is using warm water to pull out those essential oils which flavor your teas. And you can do that with fresh leaves, and you can do that with dried leaves. And then the same thing happens with oils. So when it comes to certainly with cooking or even with other uses, you're going to take that oil and you're going to heat it up. So it's that same sort of chemical process. The best, what they call carrier oils, are olive oil and coconut. And so, and I've done this kind of accidentally, where, I had a small pot, I put some olive oil in it, I put in some garlic and some rosemary and some sage. And then when I was done, I had a wonderfully scented oil that I could then pour over my vegetables, for example, without having all those little bits of herbs in there. So the oil captures the flavor of it without holding on to what at that point becomes the debris. And then essential oils. So this is a different process where you are pulling the oils out of the plant and then capturing them. We often hear about essential oils when it comes to aromatherapy, for example. You would mix essential oils into different kinds of salves or potentially cosmetics. But again, the idea is that you are capturing the essence of a plant. Sometimes it's done with alcohol, and it is a very concentrated amount of that oil. So it takes more work, more finesse. And then, of course, the possibility that you can go to town with your own cosmetics and your soaps and shampoos. This is something that's absolutely delightful to do with young ones or even older ones. I've had soap making parties with some friends. And the pleasure, again, of smelling the different herbs, deciding what you want to put into your material, and then when you actually use them, knowing that you are the one who grew it and that you are the one who created this element that you're putting on your body. So certainly with potpourris, you can take an assortment of herbs and other plants and flowers, let them dry out a little bit, and then you put them in a bowl, to scent up the kitchen or the bathroom or a bedroom. For those of you that are interested in really doing the deep dive in terms of capturing the scent, that exploration into the essential oils, or actually creating perfumes, and that definitely is a specialty. And then when it comes to herbs, the very functional role that they play with pest control, so both indoors and outdoors. So there is the laurel, the plant that we sometimes use for our cooking, the bay leaf. You can take leaves and you can put them in your cupboard. And again, there's nothing toxic about it. You can sprinkle them, you can grind them up, and then when they've lost their, sort of their strength, you just toss them away. Other things obviously are using herbs in the garden as pest control to keep pests away both above the ground as well as below the ground. So calendula, I think, is one that most people are familiar with. The idea that basil or rosemary you would put in your garden, and not only does it help keep bugs away, but you can obviously then use it in your cooking or what have you. And then the last thing, we talked about just some of the medicinal uses that herbs have. And when you look at any type of ailment that we as humans suffer, everything from emotional to physical to aches and pains to what have you, and that there is a plethora of plants out there, herbs out there, that can help with supporting our immune system, with soothing those aches and pains, and with supporting our healing process. So that is the end of this dive into the topic of herbs, hoping that we have broadened your horizon, made you a little bit curious about other things to explore, and that maybe this weekend you will be starting or expanding your own herb garden. So thank you for joining us today, and happy gardening.